Well, it's my pleasure now to introduce Janice, who most of you, well, many of you will know anyway, because she's so active in so many different spheres. Janice was 30 years as an OU teacher, and she was development director of the Wrekin Trust. She worked closely with Sir George Trevelyan. She was one of the founder members of Cana, and before that, the Bridge Trust, out of which Cana developed. She's been a Findhorn trustee for many years, and she's a networker supreme. She really is. She's been working with One Spirit and the Whole World View, and I'm sure many other groups that I know nothing of. But she's such a free thinker that she stimulates people to think in different ways and to raise our consciousness. And I think she's been doing that and helping us, many of us, to do that for many years. She's going to be talking about, first of all, death, the great adventure. And of course, Janice had a recent experience of that as she lost her husband, Alan. And her 4 daughters and the grandchildren were all there involved in that. And having just finished reading her book for a second time, I know she's added a postscript about that at the end of it, which is fascinating. So I'm going to hand over to Janice. She didn't want me to say too much, but you know the sorts of things she's been involved in for so many years. She's a war horse for the spiritual community. So over to you, Janice. Here we go.
Okay, thank you, Don. And thank you, Jenny, for bringing us into the present moment, because I think that's where life is. It's like talking to a big family, but for those who are first time at Cana, which I think quite a lot of you are, it originally stood for Christians Awakening to New Awareness. And that's one of our themes today. We are awakening to ever more awareness. But it also, when it was shortened to Cana, stands for the marriage in which Jesus turned the water into wine. So it really has an indication of transformation about it. And I think that's another theme I hope will go through what I'm saying. So I'm going to try and say quite a lot in this first talk because, well, it's hard to, here's the book that a lot of it's come from. And it's hard to put a whole book in 20-minute talk. So you're only going to get a taste of it. But my hope is that we'll expand our awareness a little bit further and particularly transform any fear that, I don't know, is maybe around about the subject of death. Because we all have to, I think, do the transformational journey from fear to love. So that's part of what it's about. We're living in a time of great change in which our horizons are expanding in many directions. And we're beginning to release the medieval ideas about death, the liturgies that often referred to from dust to dust and ashes to ashes, and the Victorian ideas of black solemnity of grief. I'm sure we all love this life, however difficult at times it may be. And in what I'm going to say, I'm drawing on 3 sources. The first is my own experience, and we all have experience that we draw on, and our experience deepens, I think, as life goes on. The second in particular is my conversations with my good friend Ursula Burton that started 3 hours after she died, unexpectedly, but that's a lot of what I'm drawing on. But thirdly, my key teacher, as Don mentioned, was Sir George Trevelyan. And he could see the future from a sort of higher perspective and used to enlighten my generation during the 1970s and 80s. I mean, I'm really grateful to him because he opened up so much. But then this was a topic that he spoke about several times. We all know that in our heads that we're going to die and probably experience the passing of loved ones. So I don't want to dismiss the experience of bereavement. As Don said, my own beloved husband of, well, we've been companions for 65 years. So you can imagine it was a huge loss when he passed about 18 months ago. And I think expanding ideas of death did help carry me through at the time. but nothing can really ease the waves of grief that come, and the jolly business of taking over all the practical things that your partner used to do. It's not easy. So I'm not dismissing that at all. So just sort of my own story slightly beginning. When I was young, my very favourite play at the theatre was Peter Pan. Not the Disney version, I hasten to say, but the lovely traditional version that used to be on the stage. And I also played the part of Peter in several school plays. And I know that James Barry, had Peter say, "To die must be a very great adventure." So that was with me since quite a young age. And obviously I grew up in World War II, so death around was also part of my life. Now, Barry was contemporary with Alice Bailey, who, writing from Dwal Cool, the master, wrote so many books, 24, I think, on esoteric philosophy. And one of those was called Death, the Great Adventure. So it could have been at that time, in the sort of early part of this 20th century, that they were sharing ideas. I don't know about that. But Sir George used to give a talk on Death, the Great Adventure. He took that title and was helping us slowly understand that we're not our bodies, and that our consciousness, as the more rational scientists say, ends when the brain ends. That is not true. So I'll quote Sir George. He used to say, "It's essential that we recognize that we are not our bodies, but that as eternal beings, we live through time-ridden bodies, and these in the end are shed like a worn-out overcoat." So my ideas were already expanding when, in my early 40s, I experienced the death of my own beloved father. I knew he was not well, and he'd gone to stay with my sister in Lincolnshire while my mother had a sort of much needed break from caring for him. I was in church at the time for the confirmation of one of our daughters, when suddenly there was my father standing in front of me. And I had this incredible sense of joy. And I thought, well, Pop can't be here if he's died, unless he's died. But if he died, I wouldn't be feeling this joy. It was an amazing sense of joy. Well, when we got home, my sister rang and said he had passed. So after that, we had some amazing conversations, and our home seemed to enter another space with him entirely. So one of the things I'd like to suggest you remember, if this is going to happen to you at any time when somebody dies, that the first week after someone dies is actually very special. So rather than rushing to practicalities, do try to spend time absorbing the death and also being available with the person who's passed as they journey on. So that was my first experience, real experience. But following that, I did have a few brief inner visits from friends who had passed, but they all said almost the same thing. Just, it was a quick thing. Please tell my husband or wife that I'm fine. And one of those was a confirmed atheist. So that was quite interesting. Her name was Colleen. This brings me to the death of Ursula, who's the subject really of these conversations, are the subject of this book. The book is called Awakening to a New Reality, Conscious Conversations Across the Horizon of Death. So if you haven't seen it, you might like to think of getting it if you're interested in this at all. Ursula and I had written together several times, and our first book was published in 1984, which we called Christian Evolution, Moving Towards a Global Spirituality. It was quite a risk at the time because it broke through several fixed beliefs, although I think it wouldn't be published now because it's old hat for those of us who are gathered here anyway. But she and I met a lot and wrote together and shared a lot. And we kind of had a sense that one of us might die before the other. She was 10 years older than me, which was understandable. and that we might write together after one of us had died. It was a very faint sense, but we didn't really discuss it much. But then she developed an inoperable cancer and had the diagnosis 3 months before her death when she was 69 years old. The passion that we had shared, I think, was very much for opening up church thinking. Traditional Christianity, we felt, was only the start of a picture. It really didn't give the whole picture of life at all. Well, at that time, I was, as Don said, working for the Open University, so I could only care for her at weekends. And another friend, Joyce Fern, cared for her during the week, and I gave Joyce a break at the weekend. After one weekend's visit, I was working at home for 2 days before going up to Milton Keynes. And on the Tuesday, Joyce rang to say Ursula had just passed. It was midday. So I packed a small bag quickly, drove to Heathrow and jumped on a plane to Edinburgh, which is where she was living. I had scarcely settled in my seat. My bag was in the overhead locker, but I always have a pen in my hand. I got one now. I always have a pen in my hand, whatever I'm doing. And to my complete surprise, we hadn't even taken off. She appeared. I could see her with my inner eye. She looked younger and radiant. And this is some of what she said. The rest is in the book. I couldn't put it all in here. I can see what you're thinking. I can see thought. How are you feeling? I asked. Fine, a bit shaky, but fine. It's freedom, glorious freedom. It's all very new, as you can appreciate. But I'm glad we have established connection so early on. We'll use this for the real work later. By that she meant writing a book. Meantime, just be with it. The apparent separation, I mean. Be with me, or what was me. The part that I've left behind along with the body. I feel I've left my ordinariness, all those everyday needs and concerns, which we all have, which is so restricting but necessary. You know how I used to fret at the limitations. Well, I can see that this is exactly what they are. Limitations imposed as part of the conditions of learning through what we have called life. But that's a misnomer. Life is so much more. Can you imagine limitless breath, space, light, purity, freedom, knowing who one truly is? We've talked about how it might be, but this is much, much more than we imagined. You have the possibility of freedom to be where you are now. Now, I've focused on that first conversation because a key thing I'd like to stress were her very first words. I can see thought. I can see what you are thinking. Now, that's a real thought. And that is exactly what my husband said when I woke and realized that he had passed next to me in the night. I can see what you are thinking. Now, he had been a wonderfully supportive husband and had often typed up writing for me, giving it back saying, well, there you are, but I don't understand a word of it. But now he did. A friend of ours who was tuned in emailed me from Canada that she had seen how delighted he was to experience, and these were her words, what you women have been on about all the time. Well, we have 4 daughters and they're all on the same page as myself. So I think at times he must have felt a little confused. It seems that as our physical bodies drop away, we experience another reality in an energy body of some kind, which seems to them as real as our bodies seem to us now. We kept Ursula's body at home for 3 days at her home, as she had asked, and Ursula did say later that her body had felt like an anchor that she could return to for a bit. We also kept my husband's body at home for 3 days, and we took it in turns to be with him and support his ongoing journey. Another very recent experience was that I took part in a Zoomed version of a funeral service of the husband of a friend. He peeped into me several times. And then when the priest was saying, "In the hopes of eternal life in heaven," he chuckled and said, "She doesn't realize I'm there already." Now, my husband never spoke about what happens after death, and we didn't have the same long conversations that I had with Ursula. But she said, death is liberating. At first, there's a mixture, bewilderment slightly, even though one has been expecting it, but then liberation, freedom. Even from a fit and healthy body, I think you would feel this, but from a sick or elderly body, it really feels like true liberation from limitation. You can step and dance, breathe freely, and feel joy all around. Then comes the adjustment. This bit is not so easy. There's a kind of review process that comes after a recovery period to get used to a new space. It's like one relives every single detail of one's life. Details that you could not possibly remember on Earth. And at the same time, you see reasons for things. How such and such fitted into a pattern. How one's own lacks, limitations of understanding, even downright obstinacy in my case, impeded a wholly natural flow. I think a key thing to say about that is there is no judgment from God or anyone else or any place else. And that we do all go through a life review and can see the things that we've done or not done and the effects for good or ill on others. So there is a kind of self-judgment. Well, we're likely to be met when we pass over by friends or those that we love who've already passed. And it seems as though we're cared for in an atmosphere of love and forgiveness, and that it is intention, it is our own intention that moves us on to new experiences. And I think that's something else to hang on to, because that also applies to this life. Ursula had a very key intention to convey to me some of what she now understood and gave a higher perspective on our life here, which is what I'll talk about in the second talk. My husband seems to be around when as a family we gather. And then about 5 months after he passed, our youngest daughter, who lives in Ireland, had pneumonia following what I think was an early COVID. And she was struggling a bit. So I asked him if he could help her. Now, I did not tell her this, and I still haven't told her actually. But the next day she rang and said she had so strongly felt the presence of Dad that she could almost feel his hand in hers. Quite moving. So it seems that it's thought that carries us forward onto our ongoing journey. And I wonder if it could be that the thoughts and prayers of others are really important, at least in the early stages, that somehow we can help them in that way. Space and time are very different there from here, and I'm sure that the next adventure calls them on as it does us. As well as insights from after-death conversations, and this is a topic which is now being researched, there are more and more after-death conversations coming. Many insights into life in the other realm have been coming from those who've had a near-death experience, an NDE. And a lot of research has recently been gone into the accounts of these people, and several good books. One person who had experienced an NDE, whom I got to know personally, was called Jeff Olson. He was American. And I met him at Findhorn in a conference on death and dying, and invited him to run a day for Cana, which he did. But when he spoke at the Cana event in London, I asked him, what is heaven like? And he said, it's like entering my mother's kitchen, so warm and so welcoming. I think that's a comforting thought. Now, another writer who did a lot to awaken us to the realities of death and dying also said of her NDE, it was simply an experience and awareness of a cosmic consciousness of life in every living thing, and the love that can never be described in words. I was in total love with all life around me. I was in love with every leaf, every cloud, every piece of grass, every living creature. So we might well be now wondering, well, what is heaven like? Now, Jesus said, in my Father's house are many mansions. This is possibly a translation from the Aramaic that has been put into language that we would understand. And possibly for mansion, I think I've always thought dwelling place or something like that. But today we may begin to see this as referring to dimensions of consciousness, frequencies of being. And just as in this world, we tend to gravitate, as we have today, to be with people whom in general we resonate. So as far as I understand it, the life beyond this, the same tendency applies. That in other words, we're drawn to be with those who are in harmonic resonance with us, because we're beginning to see that everything is energy, and energy vibrates at different frequencies, from heavy, slow, in dense materialism to very fine at these higher levels. Now, from what I've read, I think there are at least 12 dimensions of being, and there may be many more. In a later conversation with Ursula, she had moved on and said that from where she was now, it took a lot of energy to meet with me at my level. Now, we can't really know, but these ideas do make sense. Ursula also said, my work now is helping people to understand, to wake up and take directions that are in tune with God, to live in a way that promotes life in all its fullness. Why do you think we're writing this book? I then wondered about the process of dying. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has said, death is the final stage of growth in this life. There is no total death, only the body dies. The self, the spirit, or whatever you may wish to label it, is eternal. Now, Ursula had 3 months to enter this challenge of growth. As she moved into the dying process, she could see more clearly that whatever our role, we needed to move from ego to what she called essence. From focusing on the third dimensional concerns to being authentic, to holding our integrity. And that if we did do what seemed to be like a duty, to do it wholeheartedly and with love. In the last week, she began to withdraw from everyday concerns and said, I'm feeling detached from so many things. This seems to be a withdrawal from within. It feels as if all the personality stuff is being gouged out. It's bewildering at times because often my new self seems a bit of a stranger. Now, during this process of her last few weeks, she kept saying she only wanted to be with conscious friends and found others draining. It was a little bit difficult because obviously I was a gatekeeper at the door when I was there and had to sort of, I didn't quite know what to do. She felt that what she called the dross was being burnt up to let in the new energies of life and light, and said, this light helps us to expand. I see it as a finer vibration. Now, clearly, if someone can be cared for at home, then this is ideal. But for others, I think the hospice movement is a wonderful development that needs our support. It offers a caring and a willing to listen environment. A little helpful thing, if you go through this similar experience, is to remember that the hearing is the last of our senses to leave. And so even gentle mutterings at that stage can be incredibly supportive, and lovely music played as well. It's been really hard during COVID when so many families were not able to accompany their loved one during the dying process, as this does bring some sense of completion. And of course, some deaths are so sudden that shock really overrides everything else. The one thing that we do know is that both the near-death experiences and after-death communication, such as the one I'm speaking about, testify to the great sense of love that pervades us, both here and there. We're also, I think, changing our ideas of God and realizing that God is the supreme source of all, not only the creator of all life, but also is life itself, and it's within and sustaining all forms of life. We do know that this is the very ground of our being, and that it's both transcendent, but not only transcendent, also immanent in all humanity and all living things, which is why I think we're beginning to realize that nature and all life forms are sacred and need our reverence and care. So our expanding horizons are providing us a greater context in which to live, as we realize it isn't that heaven's up there and hell's down there as it used to be, but that heaven, in a way, as Jesus said, is within us. So that's all I can say really in this short time, but I hope this talk's given you a sense that consciousness does continue throughout life and through death and into further dimensions beyond, and that all is interconnected. So as you sort of absorb this, and I hope some of it's really given you a few new insights, we're going to move into breakout groups now. So you can share your own ideas and comment on anything I've said, and hear the ideas of other people. Now, the suggestion that we discuss here is that we're exploring how our own understandings are also expanding and enabling us to gain deeper insights into the nature of death, both our own and that of our loved ones. Don's put that on the screen, and so have a good 20 minutes together. Thank you.
Okay, Bill's muted everybody, I think, so we're ready to go into our second talk with Janice. I'm hoping Janice is there. I'm just trying to...
Yeah.
Yes, there you are. Yes, good. So Janice is going to tell us about life, the great adventure, and I hope, I hope it continues for a long time. Over to Janice.
Okay.
To carry on to us.
Well, this is helping us to see this life as also a big adventure. And I think we go from so many different adventures, but we're in this one now. So if I were to have a text for this talk, as a priest would, I'm going to say what it would be. It's my favorite quote from Sir George Trevelyan. Out of the confusion of a crumbling society will emerge individuals who are touched by higher guidance. These will inevitably flow together with others of like inspiration, and a new quality of society will begin to form. This is the true adventure of our time. So that was Sir George in the 70s. And I think life in this world has always been a bit of an adventure, but today it's becoming even more so. One of my favorite current teachers who's alive is Anne Baring, and she calls this time a critical moment of choice. From the first big breath, which scientists call the Big Bang, that dreamed creation into being, the dream of the supreme creator of this that we call God was to evolve a species that could join him as co-creator of the next stage of evolution. And I'm suggesting that this is the challenge that we're currently encountering. Can we rise to really be co-creators with the divine of what's happening next? So as I offer you my ideas on this topic, I don't ask you to accept them, but I'd suggest you don't reject them either. Just put them in a shelf of some kind in your mind, and they may begin to make sense or they may not. So if my ideas seem a bit way out, just sort of let them be and see if they percolate. In the conversations that I had with Ursula, her primary aim was to assist us with the challenges and opportunities of this life by sharing the higher perspective that she now had. Well, from my own experience, I know that we come into incarnation with a clear intention or soul contract of some kind. It could be to heal a past wrong. It could be to make a contribution in some field of service or to undertake a certain task. From our level, we call this awakening to our soul calling as an awakening. And we begin to remember it. Some of us when we're young, and some of us in later years, maybe even not quite yet, but we will remember it. But this is a challenge. It's a dense frequency here that we enter into. Now, Sir George used often to quote a poem by Martin Armstrong called The Cage. I'm going to read you just the first 2 lines and then the last part because it's too long. Man, half afraid to be alive, shuts his soul in senses 5. That's the opening part. The last few lines are, then from the warm ambrosial spice of flowers and fruits of paradise, which is where we've been, into the frail and fitful power of scent and tasting, sweet and sour. There in his self-created cage, ah, how safely barred is he from menace of eternity. So it's like we enter a bit of a dense cage. So here's the challenge, because the cage door is actually open and we just need the vision and the courage to walk out of it. The density of this material world can make us forget that we come from another world, which I think little children do remember. And we'll return there when this adventure comes to an end. So once here, we begin to discover the many joys and also the challenges. Now, I have read that one of the reasons some choose to incarnate here on planet Earth is for the delight of experience in a world that we can touch, see, feel, taste, and enjoy. In the early days after my husband Alan passed, I was driving to our little local town and the trees were just so lovely, and the autumn it was. And he said, yes, but you can touch them and I can't. That's interesting. So let's deeply engage with the delights of this beautiful world while we're here. I know one person who calls this deliciousness. Let's smell the roses with deep delight. Let's prepare the food with joy and gratitude. I'm told that at the Brahma Kumaris Center in Mount Abu in India, they only let cooks work in the kitchen after they've been meditating for 15 years. But the food there really does taste delicious. I've been. Another reason that we choose to have a life here is, as Ursula explains, is because it's a place for soul development. Some refer to planet Earth as a kind of schoolroom in which we work through many different lessons, some pleasant, some not so nice, until we learn from them and grow on. I guess we've all been learning quite a lot during lockdown. Don and I had to cancel a series of workshops we were going to do, which were going to kind of be book launches that he and his wife had carefully planned, and not mine. That wasn't easy. Another challenge is to remember that all expressions of the divine are part of the one life. So let's, as we go through life, begin to restore a sense of the sacred in everything. And also restore what's called the golden rule, which Jesus pronounced as, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This golden rule is in every faith, slightly differently worded, but it's the same. So if we are one, as Jesus said, the Father and I are one, it's the same, oneness, then if I hurt one of you in any way, I'm actually also hurting myself, because we are one. Now, Sir George always emphasized that holding a clear vision and a holistic worldview was only part of living more consciously, and that the other part was engaging in the transformational journey, releasing as much as we can of our identification with our personality self, or maybe we call it our ego, and enable us to fully embody our deeper soul self, Brian Holly, who's on this call and gave the last talk in the previous Cana conversation, referred to this. It's one of his main interests. Now, Ursula was a retreat director in the Catholic tradition before she died. And she used to tell me how she found ordinands were hungry to let go of their theologically trained heads and shift into an awakening of their hearts. And in the book, I've included as an appendix a prophetic piece indicating that the church for the new era will be called the Church of Love, and that all who belong, belong. Now, I don't know that this is an institution like we're used to them now, but I think it's more at a subtle level, more of a community of souls. So really one of the focusing centers where we discover all this is our hearts. And as our hearts awaken, we can look around at everyone here and know that we belong. We're all part of the one planetary family. And also part of the true adventure of this time, with a task to undertake and give birth to a new quality of society, as Sir George proclaimed. So I think that's our collective task. We considered in that first talk the reality of other dimensions of being. So I think one of our challenges is to connect with multi-dimensions of being, and it's something that we're currently learning. As Don mentioned, I've been very connected with the Findhorn Foundation, and one of the founders there, Eileen Caddy, was an example of someone who began to attune to inner guidance, and the foundation was built on that guidance. And another of the co-founders, Dorothy McLean, found she could communicate with the intelligence of nature, and that the elementals in the plant kingdoms would speak to her. There are people who can whisper to horses and understand them, people who talk to plants, and more recently trees. The Bible speaks of some of these things. It certainly speaks of angels and hierarchies of being. But the mainstream teachings of the church don't often explore the very real presence of the angelic realms. They love to assist us whenever we ask. Did not Jesus tell us to ask and you shall receive? And there's a book by Lorna Bird who says she can see angels, and she's seen them since she was a baby. And she says, I've never seen a human being without their guardian angel at their side. So this whole other dimensions is beginning to open up to us. So George put it this way: we can grasp the concept that the universe is a great living whole, shot through with creative being, in a universe that is spiritual in nature. Our world of time and space is interpenetrated by another eternal realm operating outside of time. So if we can live each present moment in full awareness of the spirit that is within us, then we have broken out of the cage described in that poem. This breaking free is going on at the moment, and many refer to it as the Great Awakening across the world. And it does mean breaking free from the pull of the third dimension, but also of the dominating powers who regard those of us who are breaking free as a threat, just as they did 2,000 years ago. The ancient fires will always come up and try and prevent what's happening. And the discoveries in 1945 of the Gnostic Gospels have given us the benefit of many other teachings of Jesus that are not in the Orthodox Bible. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "The kingdom is spread on earth, and men do not see it." So maybe that's our challenge, to begin to see it and work with it. But we're beginning to see it now, as the interpenetration, as Sir George says, of another realm from outside space and time. Now, shifting ideas that we hold is very difficult, shifting our beliefs, because we tend to identify with them. Ursula and I went through quite a time as we absorbed our changing ideas about God and wrote about it in our first book. It was published in 1984, as I said. And the ideas that are beginning to spread now are to understand that the universe we live in is in fact a hologram. Now, this has been postulated since about the 1970s. And then more recently, in 2017, my friend Jude Caravan's book, The Cosmic Hologram, provided the scientific evidence for this. And then even more lately, on April the 8th, the physicist Brian Cox, in his interview on ITV's TV AM, said that our universe might well be a hologram. I didn't see the program, but apparently the program presenters did look a bit amazed. So this is just beginning as a thought that we're getting. Now, I don't have a background in science because at school in World War II, all the scientists have been scooped into the war effort and they couldn't get a science teacher. But I do begin to understand that all is a vast hologram within which each minute cell contains the same patterning and information as the whole. This is demonstrated, I think, by the Russian dolls, and I've brought a few here. I have a set of 8, but I'll just show you some. That's a big one. There's one a bit further down. There are 8 altogether. I won't show you 8. That's a small one. And the very smallest, you can hardly see, is Weenie. It's about ½ an inch high. But they all look the same, and they're all enfolded one within each other. So I think this helps us to begin to understand that the patterning is the same at the huge level, which we could call the creative source of being and the whole universe, as it is at the small level, and we're at the small level. But if each cell is a microcosmic replication of the large one, then we are all of the same vibrational frequency, of the same patterning as the macrocosm, which is why there's an esoteric saying that as above, so below. The microcosm is a replication at a different scale as the macrocosm. So this begins to enlighten our understanding of the biblical phrase, God made man in his own image. If God is the whole, then each cell within this whole will carry the same patterning as the whole. So it really does mean we are each minute parts of the one great whole, or what Sir George called droplets of the same divinity that God is. It's quite a thought. If so, then we have a vast potential latent within us, which means we have the ability to explore the question, is a new era coming? Maybe as thoughts like this begin to be held by more people, that an era of unity consciousness that is expressed in a rich diversity of ways is beginning to dawn. I was on a call recently planning for World Unity Week in June and was warmly delighted to hear a lovely man from Ethiopia and another one from Ghana that I'd never met before and probably won't meet again, coming up with the same ideas as my own. And I remember that Ursula had said, when we meet someone, be aware that it is your soul meeting their soul and your life flowing just for a moment with their life, and that there is only one life and you are each different and unique expressions of it. So if we see this new era coming, what is our role here and now in building the new? How can we know that everything we do is actually in line with the patterning of the new? Ursula advises, ask yourself 2 things. 1, is this bringing me joy? Because if we're in tune and in flow, we will feel joy. Secondly, is my dedication and intent towards promoting life in some way? This was Ursula speaking. You are all bridge builders to the new, who in an inner sense are building a bridge from the lowest three-dimensional densities upwards and towards higher bands of expression. We pray, may thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Is this what this prayer means? Are we asking for divine help in building the new? It isn't just going to descend through the ceiling at us. It's for us to be co-creators of it. Ursula then speaks of the fourth dimensional level, as when communication is through the etheric and more subtle bodies of human energy. So the processes are telepathic in some way through auditory, visual, or sensory awareness. She then speaks about the fifth dimension, which maybe we are moving into, and says, just as gravity is a law at the third dimension, it is that at the fifth dimension, everything flows towards a pattern and a purpose in many dimensions at the same time. That's quite a big thought. The other dimensions are working with us in some way. So this brings me to my last point. She also speaks about what we call the second coming and says, as far as I can understand, this will be of global proportions, far too cosmically all-embracing to be maintained in one human frame, but rather an awakening throughout humanity to their own Christhood, their sons and daughters of Godhood, so that collectively you are moving into a higher frequency range from within which the loving expression of divinity will become the norm. And as more and more parents move into higher frequencies, so more and more babies will be born that can embody higher, more sensitively attuned expressions. I think when you look in the eyes of a small child in a pram, you can begin to see that. Man, that's humanity, as the nexus of two worlds, stands poised at this mid-between, on razor's edge, gifted beyond angels, benizoned in light, if he did but know it. So maybe we're beginning to know that we are benizoned in light and that we have a sacred role to play, as we have been cast in a major role at the interface between heaven and earth. And really, evolutionary pulse is moving us forward fast at this time. And I think it's time that we moved into this collectively. And the journey of transformation could become, and is perhaps already becoming, worldwide. So I hope the breakout groups work from the beginning this time. You're invited back into the same group, so you haven't got to know each other anew. And our suggestion for what we discuss is, what glimpses might you have of a new reality unfolding for humanity? And how might we contribute to this? And this is part of us really co-creating our adventure as we know it now. What glimpses do you have of a new reality unfolding for humanity? And how might we contribute to this? Thank you.